Hey, I'm Scott at ediblemusic.com. I'm going to show you today how to use the Novation base station synthesizer designed by GForce. And what I'll do is I'm going to break it down so that if you're not even familiar at all with how to use synthesizers, I'm going to help you understand how to use all of these crazy knobs and dials and everything. If you are familiar with synthesizers, then this will be more of an informational video about how the plugin actually works and how you can use it. But if you're in either one of those camps, I've got you covered. I'm going to start by showing you how to put sound into it. Then the next section I'll focus on how to shape the sound, and then finally in the third section I'll show you how to bring sound out of it. Okay? Those three sections. Let's start by putting some sound into it. When you open it up, you'll be faced with a keyboard. And you can choose between different playing modes. There's single, multi, auto glide, and poly, so you can play chords as well. There's also this vintage knob, and when you have it all the way off, it'll be pretty directly accurate. But as you turn the vintage up, some of the parameters will become kind of loosened, almost as though it's a hardware synthesizer that's maybe seen some experience and has been a little beat up or worn down. So you can adjust the vintage knob to introduce some of those nice little imperfections that can come with hardware units. You can also transpose between 5 different octaves. So you can play the full range of notes. On your computer keyboard, usually the shortcut is Z and X, where you can move between those. And they won't necessarily light up on there. But as I hit Z and X on my keyboard, so as you're playing, you can quickly move between octaves just by hitting those keys. Your input also includes a sequencer, but I'll come back to the sequencer and give more detail about that a little bit later on. For now, we'll come back to the keyboard. And in addition to your keyboard inputs, your vintage, you can adjust the unison of the voices. So say if I have just 4 voices here, we'll turn off that sequencer. Then the unison will kind of detune some of the voices, so it can help to really spread out and thicken up a sound just by using the unison knob. And then of course, if you have more voices enabled, that can be a really useful effect already as you're building your synthesizer sound. Then you also have portamento, which means that the notes will kind of glide or slide between each other as you hit them. So if I turn that all the way up, and I'll just turn that back down for now. Now that's how you'll start getting sound into the synthesizer, or telling it what you want it to do. The actual sound is produced by oscillators, which will produce waveforms, similar to if you play any instrument and you strike it or strum a note, then it produces a waveform. Well, with synthesizers, you have a choice of different kinds of waveforms you can use to produce the characteristic sound that you want. On the base station, there are 2 oscillators, and on this knob here, you can choose between whether you want to hear both oscillators at once or just one. And for now, I'm just going to move it over to hearing only the first oscillator. You can choose between a sawtooth waveform, which contains a really rich, complex sound, a lot of harmonics, or a sine waveform, very smooth and soft, or a pulse waveform. And And you'll notice the different characteristics between each of these sounds. The overarching thing to know about the waveforms that an oscillator produces are their min and max values. So the top of the waveform and the bottom of the waveform. If on this pulse wave, if the distance between the maximum and the minimum are equal, then it will be more of a square wave. But otherwise, you would call it a pulse wave, which goes up to the max, stays there, drops all the way back down, stays there. Whereas a triangle wave ramps up and then comes down, and a sine wave loops like that. So different ways of approaching these maximum and minimum values of a waveform. And that helps to give them their different characteristics as well. So now you'll hear both of them. And over on the right here, this spread knob will move oscillator 1 out to one side and oscillator 2 out to the other side. Now, in addition to the number of voices that you can use to drive these oscillators, you can also detune them a little bit from one another, and that will also help to create a little bit of some wavery, phasey characteristics to it that also help to widen and thicken up the sound. So if I play them here, both on triangle waveforms, you can go just a little bit, or you can go quite a lot. That one might be familiar to you. If you have a sense of how the semitones harmonize, I'll just give you a quick summary here. If it's on 5, then it will be a perfect fourth. If it's 7 semitones, it'll be a perfect fifth. If it's on 3, it will be a minor third. If it's on 4, it will be a major third. I'll switch between those again. Cool. And on the 9th, it will be a minor sixth. A lot of ways already you can make your sound really complex. And you can also hold down the shift key for really fine movements on each of these. Along with these oscillators that produce the sounds is a sub-frequency oscillator that we can add. And I'm going to make the sub-frequency a sine wave just to help you differentiate. It really bulks up the synthesizer sound, and you can determine what shape you want it to have as well. So let's say both oscillators are going to be sine waves. Now you can choose whether you want the sub to be 2 octaves below or 1. And you can also choose the range with which the second oscillator will play alongside the first one. So 8 is pretty standard. And the cool thing about this is it kind of carries over from organ design. This is usually, these numbers would refer to the length of the pipes. So 8 will be your default. At 2, and I'll turn the sub off for now. Now that takes care of the oscillator section, and you also have a sub on the second oscillator that modulates the frequency of that oscillator. So rather than having just a sub octave come in, this will actually influence how that second oscillator sounds. And you can also add some white noise, which is a good help to adjust the character of the sound that you're working on. You can kind of feel that white noise just underneath there if I turn it all up quite a bit. But just a touch is often really nice. Now, having produced the sounds using the oscillators, you have the ability to shape how it works. And you're able to do that separately for each oscillator. When you move the knob to the left, the pitch will drop. And if you move it to the right, the pitch will rise. And this LFO knob controls pitch modulation to oscillator 1. Now we should come back to the LFO. So if you have this LFO, you can see that it's blinking here, and it will be determined by the tempo. But when you introduce it, that gives some vibrato to it in accordance with that timing. So if I increase it, pretty cool. On triangle, you get a vibrato effect there. You also have the opportunity to choose which waveform shape you want the LFO to be. The delay knob will determine how soon the LFO will start to affect the keystroke. So if you wait, say, a quarter note, or even longer, and you can also choose to have it synced to the DAW or off. If it's synced, then it will lock on to each keystroke. If it's off, then the LFO will kind of just do its thing, and it, depending upon what phase or where on that min-max value of the waveform it is, that will then be affecting the sound. So it can be different depending upon what phase it's in. And that can be a really nice effect if you want some differentiation on your keyboard playing versus. And retrigger on and off means that it will either start with the keystroke or will continue going. Cool. Let's turn this back to triangle. And as you're modulating that sound, if it's set to pulse wave, then the pulse width will either lengthen those min-max values or shorten them. And you can have it be modulated either by envelope 1 over here, which I'll come to in a bit, or envelope 2, or the LFO. Depending upon what kind of effect you want the sound to have, you can determine that in either one of the 2 envelope sections or the LFO, and then you can send that into the modulation section of that oscillator. And that's identical for the second oscillator as well. If I have the second oscillator on a waveform, now I'm just going to reset this LFO by double-clicking it, and you can further shape the sound with this filter section to the right. Since we're on a triangle wave, it's very bright, a complex sound. The filter is a high cut filter, so if you move it down, it will drop off some of those higher frequencies. This, like most of what I've shown you so far, is present on a lot of synthesizers, and the filter is a really useful way to shape your sound. Often, if you have a really harsh or bright triangle sound, it's starting to sound like strings almost. Really useful to have, and so you can also shape the slope of the filter and maybe give it a bit of a resonant bump at the top. And that resonance bump can be useful to either emphasize some of the modulation you might have going on your synthesizer, or to push it forward in your mix balance by giving it some focused frequencies to be really present there. You can also have the filter be modulated by the LFO. Now, so far, these settings, I would say, describe the tonality of the sound that you're creating. On the envelope sections, that's where you can really influence the more temporal aspects of the sound, how it begins, how it sustains, and how it ends, the beginning and the middle and the end of the sound. And I'll show you how to work with that using these envelope sections here. The attack setting determines how quick the onset of the note will be. And you'll notice as I draw this knob around, there are very small increments on the left, but then once you cross over to the right side, they become much larger. So if you need to make very small adjustments to your attack, which can nevertheless be quite significant, here it is at 0, and here it is. So a very fast attack means that the sound will begin immediately. A slower attack means that it'll ease in a little bit more. If I exaggerate that, and I'll give it just a touch. Next, from that onset, there will be a little bit of a decay in the sound. So it will be maybe a little bit louder at the start, and then if you increase the decay, you can hear that little bump at the very beginning. And now it takes much longer. So if you want to make your synthesizer a little bit more percussive, then you would adjust your decay to give it that little bump. Next, the sound moves to a sustain sound. And this is how the note will remain until it's released. So there will be the onset, a little bit of a decay, and then it will hold here. And depending upon the volume setting, it can either decay by quite a lot, or only a little bit. I'll lengthen this even more to exaggerate it. So you hear it's kind of fall, and then it'll hold there. And from there, the release is the end of the note, and that determines how quickly it drops from the sustain to 0. So I'm going to lengthen that to exaggerate it as well. So even after I lift the key from the keystroke, for 3 seconds here, it will still sustain a little bit longer and have a slowish decay. Whereas if it's immediate, as soon as I lift my finger from the key, then it will release the sound. And the last dial here is velocity. So if you have a keyboard that has velocity sensitive keys, then if you turn that dial up, then the weight of your keystrokes will also determine how this envelope shape will factor into the sound that you're making. The envelope 2 below it, you'll notice that we have these envelope 2s over here, and that means that this modulation section can be controlled by the settings on these knobs, or the envelope shape. If the envelope includes this beginning, middle, and end of a sound, then you can shape that for how the modulation will function. So if I turn it all the way up, a lot of power over the different characteristics you can make for your sound. This little mod screen, you can click the triangle and you can adjust the settings. This is your pitch bend range, and you can set it to correspond with both oscillators or just one of them. Same with aftertouch, which is how the envelope will shape after a keystroke. You can also adjust your modulation settings on your mod wheel or velocity. And so you'll notice that these are by default set to the filter frequency over here. So if you move your mod wheel, you can move the filter frequency up or down, and the velocity of your keystrokes will also influence the filter. So the harder you hit, the more of the filter will kind of open up and be brighter. So it'll sound as though the music is being played a little bit harder as you're hitting the keys harder as well. And you can experiment a bit by setting them to different parts of your synthesizer, depending upon, say, if you have velocity tied to noise, then the harder that you hit your keys, the more noise will come up, or it can increase the rate of the LFO. Some very cool adjustments that you can make. You also have these two macro knobs. So now we're starting to get to the third section of outputting your sound, and you can adjust the spread and the volume. But you have these two macro knobs, so you can click and drag from these crosshairs to, let's say I'll adjust it to the noise. And now when you hold down your right mouse, you'll see that there's a different kind of meter here going on. The macro is going to influence these noise settings. So you can turn that up and the noise will come up. And say if you have this on a modulating section, then turning the macro up and down is a really easy way to adjust for that. And you can also set it to multiple settings. So I'll have that set to the LFO as well. Really useful. And so you can make two separate ones. You can set your macros to as many knobs as you want. Also a really fun thing to experiment with. And so all you do again is just you click and drag from this crosshair, and then it will give you a bit of a different look here, and you right click to adjust that, while simply left clicking will adjust the dial itself. Really cool. In addition to the LFO and the envelope shaper, which are pretty conventional to synthesizers and are really important parts of making the characteristics of your sound the way that you would like them to, the LFO adds some cool little modulation effects that are pretty steady, while the envelope shaper helps to shape that beginning, middle, and end feature of your sounds. You also have the XLFO and ADSR, and these are the same kinds of controls. They're just on sliders now. So you can see that the X ADSR is labeled very similarly to the envelope shapes with attack, decay, sustain start, time, and release. And the LFO has very similar controls here. But the thing about this is that they add some additional capabilities to some of the selected parameters. So if I were to choose between oscillator mix, and we'll set each oscillator on different waveforms, then I'll adjust the amount, and you can see that it starts to have this glow to it. Then it will switch between the two oscillators. At the rate that you have it set at. And you can set this additional kind of LFO or envelope style modulation to pretty much any parameter. You can see that the selected parameter changes depending upon what I have selected. So I'll adjust the envelope attack . So now it's adjusting the filter as well, letting that brightness come in. And the velocity is similar to the delay here, where you either want it to come in right away or a little slower. So you can really start to have a really tremendous effect on the shape of your sounds, even beyond filter and the envelope and the LFO, but the same logic will apply. So this XLFO functions in the same way that I mentioned that an LFO does. The XADSR functions in the same way that the envelope shaper does. It's just that you can have parameters on parameters adjusted. And so things can get really fun and complicated, but it's useful to be able to recognize visually, okay, so this oscillator mix is being influenced by this XLFO, and you can clear it if you like. And this frequency is being affected by the XADSR, which you can also clear. Now, with the sound coming out of the synthesizer that you've made, you have some effects that you can apply. In addition to the low-pass filter on this blue strip, you also have a high-pass filter that you can add if your track is maybe a little bit too heavy on the low end. Then you can set it, and this is really useful just to help your synthesizer sit in your mix the way that you'd like it to. You can increase the resonant bump there as well, and you can have it track with what you're playing. Then you have a few types of distortion you can add. Nice and soft. You can harden it up. I'm just going to turn it down while I add this. You can have a really gritty sound. And you have a mix knob on the distortion too if you just want to tuck that distortion in. The chorus is another really useful way to influence the sense of width. If you have the depth maybe just up a bit, turn it back up again. Let's add 4. You can hear how the image of the synth just kind of changes a little bit with the chorus effect on. This can be useful if you want to set your synthesizer a little bit further back in the mix, because that phasiness will kind of make it a bit unclear compared to other instruments that you might have going on, like percussion or something like that. You also have some spatial effects like delay. You can keep them synced to your workstation You can link the left and right times, or you can have the crossfeed, which will create kind of a ping pong delay. And you can adjust the feedback as well. If you want to just have this nice little slap, or a long delay. Really cool. And reverb, of course, will give you a big sense of space. They have some presets here. I'll just click through them. A nice slight reverb there, and then the fourth and fifth are much bigger. Now, just using your keyboard is one way of getting all these sounds going. When we come back to the sequencer, there's an arpeggiator section here, and the rate will determine the speed of the arpeggiation. The swing will alter the timing. So it kind of feels as though you're skipping a bit, and it gives a bit of a sense of groove to it. And the octave will determine how far that you want the note to travel. So you could have it go to +2 or higher, and the mode will determine what direction the notes will go. You can either have it go up or down, or both, or random. The sequencer, you can see that we've still got this swing and octave on the left part of the window here, but now we've got all of these note inputs that you can add. And there are a couple different ways you can use it. If you have the state set to hold, just hitting a note will trigger the sequencer. If you have it set to key, then the sequence will start when you hit a key, and it will stop when you release that key. And it'll also transpose this sequence to the note that you've hit. So if I start here, versus cycle, which will sync to the DAW playback. So I'm hitting keys right now, but since the DAW isn't playing back, then you won't hear anything. As I showed you earlier, you hit record to input your steps. You can also click if you like. And once you've got a sequence made, you can click and drag this MIDI crosshair icon out to your DAW, and it'll transfer a MIDI track for you. So if you wanted to make use of that MIDI information in some other tracks using some other instruments, then you can just drag it out of Base Station and into your workstation. You can also edit where you want the start and stop times of your sequencer to go. So let's say I just want to hear these middle ones. Really useful. You could also set the start and stop times at kind of odd intervals. So it'll skip that middle section altogether. So if you have maybe some writer's block, I think using a sequencer sometimes can be really useful to just set up some notes and then move the start and stop times around and see if anything appealing kind of shows up. Or of course, you can write it in order to make sure that it tracks with your song. But I find it can be useful to break some creative blocks as well. When you have these accent settings selected, then the macro and the velocity settings will have an impact on the characteristics of that particular step in the sequence. And when you have slide on, then it will slide between the notes. Let's turn it on for all of these guys. So it smooths out the note transitions. If you wanted to have a part where it's dropping very smoothly, then that's how you would do that on the step sequencer. And probability determines whether or not that step will be played. So you could set it all the way down to a quarter. I'll set this one to half, and let's see if they show up. It skipped that time. Cool. You can also right click and drag, and that will change them all together so you can draw in your sequence. And of course you can randomize the pitch, the note length, and the velocity. Let's randomize the note length. Pretty neat. And that's why I think that sequencers can be useful if you're feeling a little bit stuck. You can just punch in something random, and if even a sliver of the step sequence sounds appealing to you, then you can maybe pull that out and make a melody around it and then make a whole song. That can be started just from hearing some random notes collected together that you might not have been able to come up with off the top of your head if you're stuck working. Now, so you've got a sense of how to get sounds into the bass station, how to manage them and shape them and give them the characteristics you want by adjusting all of these wild numbers of parameters that you can use. Remember, the XLFO and the XADSR function very similarly to the LFO and the envelopes. And once you've got a hang of those, then you can see how they influence the oscillators and the shapes of the sounds that you can make. And from there, by making the sound, having input it, you also have influence over how the sound comes out of it using these different tonal, harmonic, and spatial effects or time-based effects like chorus and delay and reverb. So if you've got this plugin, give it a try. Let me know how it goes, especially if you're just getting started using synthesizers. I'd love to know what you think. Try it out.